First thing I remember is the sound of the monitor, not the crash, not the ambulance, just that steady, mechanical beat pulling me back from somewhere very dark and the antiseptic smell of a place I didn't want to be. My throat was sandpaper. My left shoulder felt like someone had driven a nail through it and forgotten to remove it. I tried to move my fingers and they responded, slowly, like they were remembering how. Then I heard her voice. She's still not showing consistent response. That was a nurse, somewhere to my left. And then, softer, closer, my mother. I know, sweetheart, I'm right here. I opened my eyes, or I tried to. The light was brutal. I managed a slit, enough to see the pale yellow ceiling of what was clearly a hospital room, and my mother's face hovering above me, eyes red, hair pulled back in that hasty bun she only does when she hasn't slept. I tried to say her name. What came out was a dry, broken sound, barely a syllable. Her eyes went wide, and then she did something I did not expect. She pressed one finger to her lips, slowly, deliberately, and she glanced toward the door. I didn't understand, but something in her face, not panic, something colder than panic, something calculated, made me close my eyes again, made me keep still. 2 minutes later, I heard the door open. Any change? A man's voice. My husband's father. Nothing yet, the nurse said. Footsteps. More than one person. I kept my breathing shallow even. I had no idea why. My mother had looked at me like it was important, so I did it. The doctor said the next 24 hours are critical. That was my mother-in-law. Her voice had that particular tone she used at dinner parties when she wanted everyone to know she was the most composed person in the room. I spoke to Harrington this morning. My father-in-law, lower now, like he thought the walls had thinner ears than they did. He says the timeline still works. As long as everything stays quiet for another week, the transfer goes through without her signature. I stopped breathing. My mother-in-law made a small sound. And if she wakes up? A pause. Then we move to the contingency. The prenuptial has the incapacity clause. If she's deemed unable to manage her affairs for more than 30 days, oversight transfers to the estate trustee, which is me. I lay there perfectly still and felt something crystallize inside my chest. Not fear, something much more useful than fear. My name is Fiona Adler. I'm 31 years old. I was a financial analyst at a mid-sized wealth management firm in Calgary when I met my husband at a fundraiser for the Foothills Hospital Foundation. I am meticulous, methodical, and I have never once in my professional life signed a document I didn't read 3 times. Except one. I married into the Voss family 14 months ago. Owen Voss. Charming, handsome Owen, who brought me wildflowers from the Kensington Farmers Market on our 3rd date and cried, actually cried, at his grandmother's funeral 2 weeks before our wedding. I thought I knew exactly what I was marrying into. I did not read the prenuptial agreement carefully enough. I skimmed it. I trusted the family lawyer, a man named Harrington, the same name I had just heard, who Owen's father had introduced as practically family. I had been so tired. We were closing on the house. I had 2 client presentations that week, and Owen had kissed the top of my head and said, "It's just a formality fee. You know I'd never use it against you." I know how that sounds. I work in finance. I tell clients every single week that love is not a legal instrument. And I had still skimmed it. I had 14 months of marriage to think about what I actually knew. Owen worked in his father's commercial real estate development company. We had a joint account for household expenses, but Owen had insisted on keeping our investment portfolios separate for tax efficiency, which I had accepted because, professionally, that's often sound advice. What I had not paid enough attention to was the way his father, Gerald, appeared at our house unannounced 3 times in the last 4 months. The way Owen had started taking calls in the garage. The way 2 envelopes from a law firm had appeared in our mailbox addressed to Owen alone and disappeared before I could ask about them. I had been building a story in my head that explained all of it away. Busy season at the firm. Family dynamics. Normal marriage friction. I was lying in a hospital bed now because a transport truck had run a red light on 14th Street and hit the passenger side of our car. Owen had been driving. He walked away with a bruised sternum. I was the one in the ICU. Except now I was understanding that I needed to pay very close attention to the word accident. My mother visited twice a day for the next 4 days. On the second day, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand during a moment when the room was empty and the door was closed. On it, in her cramped schoolteacher handwriting, she had written 3 sentences. Gerald asked the nurse about your prognosis separately from me. Owen has not called or visited since day 1. I don't trust them. She had drawn a small question mark at the bottom. I held the paper under my blanket and thought about what it meant to be underestimated. On the third day, Owen came. He brought tulips, which he knew I didn't particularly like, and sat in the chair beside my bed with the particular expression of someone performing concern. He held my hand. He told me the house was fine, the cat was fine, work had sent flowers. He said, "Take all the time you need," in the tone of someone who is counting very carefully on a specific amount of time. I watched him. I had spent 14 months cataloging the micro-expressions of a man I thought I loved. I knew the difference between the way his eyes moved when he was relaxed and the way they moved when he was calculating something. He didn't meet my gaze more than twice in 20 minutes. He left after half an hour, and I asked my nurse for a phone. My best friend from university, a woman named Priya, who was now a family law attorney in Toronto, picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice low. I told her everything I had heard. I told her about the prenup, about Harrington, about the incapacity clause. There was a silence on the other end that was not the comfortable kind. "Fee," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. Do not let anyone tell you what you do or don't remember about that accident. And I need you to get me a copy of that prenup. I don't have it here." "Where is it at home?" "Filing cabinet in the office. Bottom drawer, red folder." "Can your mother get it?" I looked at the door. "Yes." "Okay. I'm flying to Calgary Thursday." I put down the phone and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then I called my mother. She retrieved the folder that evening. She photographed every page and emailed them to Priya before she'd even left my driveway, she told me later. Then she came to the hospital and sat with me while I ate the worst bowl of soup I've ever tasted in my life, and she didn't ask me any questions I couldn't answer yet, which is one of the things I love most about her. Priya arrived Thursday afternoon with a rolling carry-on and an expression that I recognized from our first year of law school when she was about to dismantle someone's argument, brick by brick. She spread printed pages across the tray table beside my bed and put on reading glasses I'd never seen her wear before. "Okay," she said, "here's what you signed." The prenuptial agreement was 18 pages. The section I had apparently skimmed was Clause 11, subsection C, buried in language about spousal incapacity and estate management. It stated that in the event of a medically documented incapacity lasting 30 or more consecutive days, Gerald Voss, named specifically as estate trustee, would assume temporary management authority over all jointly held and commingled assets. The clause had a sub-provision about independent verification that, on close reading, referred to an independent assessor who was also named specifically, a Dr. Fenwick. I had never heard of Dr. Fenwick, but Priya had already searched the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Alberta registry that morning. Dr. Fenwick had received a formal reprimand in 2019 for providing documentation that had been deemed not consistent with clinical evidence in an estate proceeding in Red Deer. I stared at the page for a moment. They planned this. "I don't know how long," Priya said carefully, "but I think this clause was not standard language. I think it was drafted specifically." She took off her glasses. "Fee, the accident." "I know." "The police report lists it as the transport driver's fault. He ran a red." "I know." But if someone had information about that driver's route? I know, Priya. We sat with that for a moment. What do you want to do? She asked. I thought about Gerald's voice in that hospital room. The way he had said, as long as everything stays quiet. The way he had assumed I was not listening because he had decided I was not relevant. The way Owen had sat beside my bed holding my hand and looked at the wall instead of my face. I want everything, I said. I want documentation of every asset they've moved or attempted to move. I want the full financial history of that company going back to when Owen and I got together. I want every email that went through any account connected to this prenup. I paused. And I want it done before anyone in that family realizes I'm not as concussed as they think I am. Priya looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, just slightly. Good, because I already filed for your medical records under your own power of attorney this morning, which means Gerald's trustee authority cannot be triggered while you are demonstrably competent. You have a window? I was released from the hospital 11 days after the accident. My discharge notes described a full recovery from the concussion, a healing clavicle fracture, and no lasting neurological effects. I went to my mother's house in Tuscany, the Calgary neighborhood, not the Italian region, and I did not go home. Owen called 4 times. I answered twice, kept my voice soft and a little vague, said I needed more rest, that my mother was taking good care of me, that I'd be back soon. He sounded relieved both times I answered. That told me everything. Priya had engaged a forensic accountant, a woman named she'd worked with on a case in Vancouver, who now operated out of Edmonton. She had also, with my authorization, requested disclosure of all joint financial records as part of a preliminary legal process she filed quietly with a Calgary court. The request was routed through a firm name Owen wouldn't recognize. What came back over the next 3 weeks was not a surprise exactly, but seeing it laid out in black and white still felt like cold water. Owen and his father had been systematically moving assets that should have been considered jointly held under Alberta's Matrimonial Property Act. Our joint savings, which I had contributed to equally from my salary for 14 months, had been drawn down by transfers to a numbered company that Gerald controlled. The family's development company had a contract with a Calgary area construction firm that was billing for work on a property Owen and I theoretically co-owned, but the payments were flowing into an account I had never been named on. The numbered company, in turn, had made 2 transfers to a trust instrument that was set up the month before our wedding. The month before our wedding. I sat in my mother's kitchen with these documents spread across the table, drinking her terrible instant coffee because neither of us had bothered to buy the good beans, and I thought about Owen bringing me wildflowers from the farmer's market. I thought about him crying at his grandmother's funeral. I thought about every time he had called me Fee, in that soft way, like the shortening of my name was an act of tenderness. I had not been loved. I had been selected. There is a difference, and I understand that now with a clarity that is almost impersonal. Priya filed the formal separation application on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 weeks after my accident. Under Alberta law, separation does not require mutual consent. It requires intent, demonstrated by living separately, which I had been doing at my mother's house, and, ideally, documented evidence of the date that intent began. We had that. We also had something Gerald had not anticipated, a forensic audit request filed simultaneously with the court, citing reasonable grounds to believe matrimonial property had been dissipated. The judge granted a preservation order within 48 hours, which froze the numbered company's assets and the joint accounts pending full disclosure. Gerald called Owen within minutes of being served. I know this because Priya had advised me to document all communication attempts from the Voss family, and Owen called me 12 times that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemails went from confused to frustrated to something that was almost a threat, though carefully worded. Priya listened to all of them and noted the timestamps. I never called back. The settlement negotiation took 4 months. Gerald hired a senior litigator from a Bay Street-affiliated firm that had a Calgary office. Priya, who had 15 years of family law and was not remotely intimidated, countered every position with documentation the other side clearly had not expected us to have. The forensic accountant's report detailed $1,340,000 in matrimonial property that had been moved or encumbered without my knowledge or consent since the date of our marriage. Under the Matrimonial Property Act, I was entitled to an equalization of that property. Owen's lawyer pushed back on the incapacity clause in the prenup, arguing it was valid. Priya argued that a clause naming a specific independent assessor with a documented history of irregular practice was not a good faith provision and would not survive judicial scrutiny. They knew she was right. They settled. I also filed a separate complaint with the Law Society of Alberta regarding Harrington's conduct in drafting and witnessing a prenuptial agreement that contained provisions he had a conflict of interest in, given his long-standing relationship with Gerald Voss. That complaint is still being reviewed. I check on it occasionally, in the same way you check on something you've set in motion and don't need to rush. As for the accident, I provided everything I had to the Calgary Police Service. The transport driver's route, the specific intersection, the timeline that Priya had helped me reconstruct from traffic camera records obtained through disclosure. The investigation is ongoing. I have been told not to discuss the details, so I won't. But I will say that I no longer describe what happened on 14th Street as an accident when I'm talking to people I trust. Gerald Voss assumed I was unconscious. He assumed that even if I woke up, I was too shaken, too emotionally compromised, too deeply in love with his son to think clearly. He had looked at 14 months of a woman who smiled at his dinner parties and deferred gracefully on topics she didn't care about, and he had concluded that she was manageable. He had not accounted for the fact that I spend my professional life evaluating risk in documentation that other people find too technical to read carefully. He had not accounted for the fact that I have a best friend who is a very good lawyer. And he had not accounted for the fact that the moment I understood what was happening, I stopped feeling anything that looked like grief and started feeling something that looks a lot more like focus. I'm back in Calgary now. Different apartment, Beltline neighborhood, 9th floor with a view of the downtown skyline that I genuinely love. I went back to work in January. My colleagues brought muffins on my first day back and pretended not to notice that I was quieter than I used to be. I appreciate that. I started doing pro bono consultations 3 months ago, financial literacy sessions for women going through divorce proceedings, run through a legal clinic in the city's northwest. I sit across from women who are smart, capable, often professionally accomplished, who somehow ended up in a room they didn't see coming. I don't tell them my story because it's not what they're there for, but I know what it is to have the specific clarity of understanding exactly how underestimated you were. I keep a copy of the settlement on my phone, not because I need to look at it, just because having it there reminds me that I am someone who reads everything now, every clause, every subsection, every provision about what happens if someone decides I am no longer relevant. Last month, Owen left a voicemail. It was 3 minutes long. I listened to approximately 40 seconds of it, enough to understand the general shape of what he was trying to say, which was the shape of a man who has finally encountered consequences and finds them unfair. I deleted it. Then I blocked the number. I think about who I was the morning of that accident sometimes. A woman who trusted because it felt unkind not to, who skimmed because she was tired, who looked at red flags and called them the natural texture of a complicated family. I don't blame her. She was doing the best she could with the story she had decided to believe. But I am not her anymore, and whatever comes next, I will read every word of it. There's a specific kind of stillness that comes after everything falls apart and you realize you're still standing. I think about that hospital room a lot. The beeping monitor, the antiseptic smell, my mother's finger pressed to her lips. And what strikes me now is not the fear I felt in that moment, but how quickly fear turned into something else entirely. Something clear. Something I could work with. Gerald assumed I was manageable because I had been pleasant at dinner parties. Owen assumed I was trusting because I loved him, and maybe they were right for a while. But there's a difference between someone who is kind and someone who is unaware. I was the first one. They mistook me for the second. I think about the version of myself who skimmed that prenup. I've made peace with her mostly. She was exhausted. She was in love, or something she had decided to call love. She trusted a man who had spent months carefully constructing the conditions of her trust. That is not stupidity. That is what happens when someone with bad intentions is also patient and deliberate. The failure wasn't in her character. It was in the information she had, and the information she was never meant to have. What changed everything was not rage. It wasn't even grief, though that came later, in quieter moments, when I let myself feel the actual weight of 14 months of a marriage that had been a calculation from at least one side. What changed everything was a decision to think clearly when the easier thing would have been to fall apart. Priya on the phone, my mother photographing documents in my home office at 9 in the evening, a forensic accountant in Edmonton building a picture out of numbers that were supposed to stay hidden. None of that happens if I spend those first weeks in shock instead of motion. I'm not saying I wasn't scared. I'm saying I decided that being scared and being functional were not mutually exclusive. The thing about integrity, real integrity, not the performative kind, is that it holds even when no one is watching, and even when holding it is expensive. Gerald and Owen built their plan on the assumption that the rules were optional when the stakes were high enough. That assumption is what undid them, not me. Not Priya's legal filings or the forensic accountant's report, the assumption itself. Because systems built on the idea that rules don't apply to you are structurally unstable. They require an enormous amount of ongoing effort to maintain. And the moment someone starts asking the right questions and documenting the answers, the whole architecture starts to crack. I work with women now who are sitting across from me at a clinic table, smart and capable and utterly blindsided by the shape their lives have taken. I don't offer them a roadmap because there isn't one. What I offer is this: the capacity to think carefully, even when you are afraid, is not something that gets used up. It doesn't run out. And the willingness to keep moving forward through something genuinely hard, not because it's easy, but because the alternative is staying exactly where someone else decided you belong. That willingness is not a personality trait you either have or don't. It's a choice you make, sometimes hour by hour, until it becomes the direction you're moving in. I read everything now, every word of everything, not out of paranoia, but out of respect for myself, for the version of me that deserved that all along.